started. Gawati kai tawa haupa dushanome kutu tuwitsa kohayahano shroshka washti. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, the American Indian Alaska Native Tourism Association webinar series today. In partnership with the National Park Service, Ayanta presents today's educational webinar, Missions and Tribes, including Native Perspectives in the Historical Record. My name is Bianca Mitchell. I am from the Pueblo of Acoma, and I am Ayanta's Education Manager. Serving as today's webinar moderator, I will be managing the question and answers at the end of the presentation. For those of you who are not familiar with Ayanta, for nearly 2 decades, Ayanta has served as the national voice for American Indian nations engaged in cultural tourism. In addition to serving as the voice for Indian country tourism, Ayanta provides technical assistance and training to tribal nations and Native-owned enterprises engaged in tourism, hospitality, and recreation. Ayanta's mission is to define, introduce, grow, and sustain American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian tourism that honors traditions and values. Ayanta's educational offerings include our upcoming Go International. It's a virtual conference this year on April 21st and 22nd. This conference is designed to help tribal tourism businesses keep up with the rapid shifts in the package travel landscape. Go International features expert speakers and hands-on presentations that will guide tribal enterprises and businesses in conceptualizing and developing their tourism products and promoting them to tour operators, wholesalers, and domestic and international group travelers. You can register today online at ayanta.org/gointernational. Ayanta also provides educational opportunities for tribes through our American Indian Tourism Conference, or AITC. The 2021 AITC event will be held in Fort McDowell, Arizona at the Wekopa Casino and Resort on October 25th through the 28th. Please visit our website at ayanta.org to learn more about our educational programmings. And you can also find more information on our American Indian Tourism Conference at the aitc.org/AITC. Again, thank you for joining us this morning for today's webinar, Missions and Tribes, including Native Perspectives in the Historical Record. Today we have with us from the National Park Service, Naomi Torres, who is our superintendent, and also Andrew A. Galvan, the curator for Old Mission Dolores in San Francisco, California. Just a little bit of background on Andrew. When Andrew was named the curator of San Francisco's famed Old Mission Dolores in 2004, he became the first American Indian to oversee a California mission. At the time, he joked he wanted to hang a banner in front of the mission that read, "Under new management." Recent research has discovered his great-great-great-great-grandfather's baptismal entry in the registers of Mission Dolores, which dates back to November 1794. During this webinar, Andy will detail his personal journey and how he reconciled the history of the area tribes with the story previously being told by the California missions. He will further share tips for other curators of Native American history at both tribal and non-Native facilities alike, on steps they can take to present a more complete version of history with the visiting public. At this time, I would like to introduce Naomi, and the partnership between Ayanta and the MPS will result in a guide of the Juan Bautista de Anza National Historic Trail that showcases tribes and their cultural heritage attractions located along the trail. Good morning, Naomi.
Good morning. Thank you, Bianca. I'm so pleased, and thank you to Ayanta. I'm so pleased to be working with Ayanta to share the stories of tribes along the Anza Trail. In fact, more than a year ago, the Anza Trail and Ayanta embarked on this collaborative project to develop a tribal travel guide along the Anza Trail, as well as a map that identifies the sites and locations along the route in native languages. But an important part of this project are webinars like these to raise awareness and to also chronicle the stories of the tribes that are on or near the Anza Trail. You'll see this map if you open it up in the larger full screen, you'll be able to read a little bit of it. But just to share with you a little bit about the Anza Trail, It's the Juan Bautista de Anza National Historic Trail, is one of 30 national scenic and historic trails in the United States. And the Anza Trail, for short, because it's such a big mouthful to say, commemorates the route taken by Spanish colonists in 1775, 1776. Led by Juan Bautista de Anza. Anza recruited soldiers from what are now the states of Sinaloa and Sonora. He recruited them to bring their families to establish colonial Spain's northernmost presidio or fort, the Presidio of San Francisco. And a couple of days later, they founded the site of Mission Dolores, of which Andy will be talking about today. On this colonizing expedition, there were 30 families, 240 men, women, and children who traveled from Sonora to San Francisco. On this map, it notes there were just a few missions that existed in California when the expedition came through, including Mission San Gabriel, Mission San Luis Obispo, and Mission San Antonio. And but the expedition resulted and continued colonization of California, resulted in the construction of many more missions. And those missions, most of them were built by the hands of Native peoples. And these missions, based on the feudal approach, changed the lives of Native people. And even while the expedition was at Mission San Gabriel, there was a revolt at Mission San Diego. And this calls attention to, oftentimes when we frame the Anza Trail historically, the story of Native people, framed from that perspective, is often that of survival and resilience. But this project with Ayanta is working to tell the Native part of that story, historically around resilience, but most importantly, we want to share what the tribes are doing along the route today and what they offer visitors today, to share the richness of culture and heritage. And but also, these missions are our sites and they draw hundreds of thousands of visitors traveling, and a great opportunity to share that story as well from a different framework. And it's so exciting to see missions like Mission Dolores and people like Andrew Galvan to tell the story from a different perspective. So it's my pleasure to feature Andrew Galvan in today's webinar. I met Andrew when I worked at the Presidio of San Francisco, and we developed an interpretive exhibit about the modern Ohlone Indians living in the Bay Area and sharing their heritage, along with images of their ancestors. And when he took the position as curator at Mission Dolores, the exhibit that we had created was at the Chrissy Field Center, which saw a few people. But when he became the curator at Mission Dolores, Andy was instrumental in getting that exhibit more visibility and onto the walls of Mission Dolores. And many more people, many national, international visitors were able to see that and see that heritage. This project and other projects with Andy have influenced and impacted how we share the stories of the Anza Trail. Working with Andy throughout these years has challenged my assumptions about narratives about the Anza Trail and Spanish colonization. And it's really broadened my understanding of the complexities of these stories. It's not such a simple story. They're layered and very complex. And it's a learning path that we continue to take on the Anza Trail. And I hope within the National Park Service. And so with that, I am pleased to introduce our featured speaker, Andrew Galvan, curator of Mission Dolores at San Francisco.
Thank you, Naomi. Bianca, were you going to ask the poll questions now, or? I guess not.
Yes,
right.
Yes. No, I couldn't get control of the mouse until now. Hold on. So yes, I will bring up those poll questions. If you can all just take a minute to answer some of the questions that Mr. Andrew has provided for you. Number one, have you visited any of the 21 Alta California missions? Number two, have you visited any of the following San Francisco Bay Area missions? Number 3, have you visited the Presidio of San Francisco? And number 4, do you know the names of the Indian tribes indigenous to where you currently live? Number 5, do you belong to an American Indian, Alaska Native, or Native Hawaiian tribal group? And number 6, what Ayanta region do you represent? So give it a few seconds here, and then we're gonna stop the polling, and I will show you those results. We'll give it about 10 seconds here to get majority of, I think we have 100, almost 120 right now with us. Thank you all again for joining us. I'm going to end the polling and share the results. Wow, we're about even with have you visited any of the 21 Alta California missions? 50% each, yes and no. Have you visited any of the following San Francisco Bay Area missions? 68% none. About 21% of you have visited San Francisco Mission Dolores. Have you visited the Presidio of San Francisco? 55% no, said no, but 45% have. That's great. Do you know the name of the Indian tribes indigenous to where you currently live? 97% said yes. That's awesome. Number 5, do you belong to an American Indian, Alaska Native, or Native Hawaiian tribal group? 28% said yes, 72% said no. And what Ayanta region do you represent? And the Pacific region took over this webinar session at 36%. So thank you all again for taking the poll, and we will continue with Andrew's presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Naomi, for the introduction. And thank you, Bianca, for inviting me to present today. I'd like to start with the map that Naomi was on. Click it. Yeah, there we are. So you see up at the very top of the map is the San Francisco region. And so that's the area that I'm going to be speaking to this morning, is the San Francisco Bay region, as that is where I live, I work, and that is where my native ancestry comes from. I have Ohlone blood, which is San Francisco Bay region. I have Bay Miwok blood, which is San Francisco East Bay. I have Patwin blood, which is up towards the Napa area. And I have Plains Miwok blood, which is near Sacramento, California. All those tribal groups intermarried at the various missions of the San Francisco Bay region, and there is where my ancestry is. So, I'm trying to get this, yes. Anyway, it's suddenly I have a little bit of the Spanish expedition came from the south using those very trails that were created by California tribal people for travel and trade. So what becomes the Anza Trail was already a road that was out there. The trails were widened and are now referred to as El Camino Real, the King's Highway. Highway 101 pretty much follows the same route north to south on the state of California. Some people often think when we say El Camino Real, that has something to do with God, meaning the King's Highway. No, it has to do with the King of Spain. It's the King's Royal Road. And since taxpayer dollars paid to the King of Spain paid to build the road, they figured they might as well name it after him also. Along this road, there were 21 missions established. Now, that's why I'm always clear. I say 21 Alta California missions, 21 Upper California missions, as it were, because in Baja California, there are 32 missions, which are often forgotten in the telling of the story of the California missions. The first mission was established in 1697. So by the time the mission project gets to San Diego, it's almost 100 years old. When we get north to San Francisco, we find that Mission Dolores, which you see there, the whitewash building is the original mission church, completed in 1791, and the larger Basilica Church next door was completed and dedicated in 1918. So it's just over 100 years old. But Mission Dolores is not only the oldest Roman Catholic Church building in use in the modern state of California, it is also a school and tourist site visited by more than 300,000 people each year. Now, I know some mission studies people might say, now, wait a minute, Andy, if it was only finished in 1791, how is it the oldest building? It's the oldest standing intact building. Many of the other earlier missions established before Mission San Francisco fell down through either neglect and sometimes through earthquake. And we know San Diego was actually burnt down by the Indians. So that's how Mission Dolores ends up being the oldest adobe church, because then somebody might say, well, the stone church at Carmel or the stone church at Santa Barbara are older. We mission folks are always arguing and bragging along the trail. Who has the biggest, the best, et cetera, et cetera. So we get about 30,000 California school children. And that's what Naomi was talking about when we brought the Faces exhibit that Naomi had put together at the Presidio, at the Chrissy Field of Mission Dolores. We had busloads and busloads of people visiting. We have captive audiences, in other words, learning about the history. And we are proud to be part of the California history since 1776. And therefore, we're conscious of our duty to preserve this history for future generations. So the story of the Indian folks in San Francisco begins more than 245 years ago, when people from the local village of Chuchui walked through the doors of Mission San Francisco de Asís and were baptized as Christians. My great-great-great-great-grandparents, Poilemja, whose Christian name is Faustino, from the Bay Miwok village of Saklan, which is modern-day Walnut Creek, California, and his wife, Jock Bachme, Christian name Obelinda, from the Ohlone village of Halkeen, which is modern-day Hayward, were two of the thousands of American Indians the Spanish rounded up from the surrounding countryside to build and sustain the adobe San Francisco church, now known as Old Mission Dolores. I have to qualify that when I say the Spanish rounded up, because we know clearly my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Poilemja, he did not voluntarily come into Mission Dolores. We know from the mission records that on the day he arrives in San Francisco, they estimate he's age 30, and that there are 18 other adult males from his village who were brought into the mission, and on that very day they were baptized. There was no training in the religion. It was simply, you're here, we're going to pour water on you, we're going to make you Christians, and now you need to stay here. So sometimes when people say there wasn't forced conversion, I use that as a qualifier to say, excuse me, but I don't know any other way you can describe forced conversion than baptizing somebody on the day they arrive. They're speaking their native language. The padre is performing the ritual in Latin, and the soldiers are speaking Spanish. Do you think the native people had any idea what the words meant? So here you have Mission San Francisco on October the 4th, 1816. And if you look to the far left of the drawing that you're seeing, you see two padres standing on the facade of Mission Dolores. And then you see the dancers there in the circle in the plaza, but you don't see only one dance group. If you look beyond, you see 2 and 3, maybe even 4 dance groups. I call this the first documented powwow in California. Even though we really didn't do powwows in California, we did big times. But the crucial reason I show this slide often is if you look at the date, October 4th, 1816. October 4th is the feast day of St. Francis, for whom San Francisco is named after. But 1816 is 40 years into the life of the mission. And here you see native peoples still dancing and still wearing native regalia. I often like to say that at this point, somehow native peoples were allowed to continue traditional practices under the eyes of the padres. So much for everything was destroyed. Most things were destroyed or altered, but for whatever reason, it was possible for this drawing to be documented. My angel's having a little bit of trouble making the slides move quickly. So I can trace the milestones of my ancestors' lives through the old mission records, the baptismal registers, the marriage registers, and the death registers. Poilenja, Faustino, who I mentioned earlier, was baptized at Mission Dolores in 1794. Jock Bakme Obelinda, a later convert, was baptized in 1802. Their 14-year-old son, Culpesque, Liberato's his Christian name, was baptized in 1801. He married at Mission Dolores and then was widowed. And in 1818, Liberato was allowed to move across the bay to Mission San Jose in what is now the city of Fremont. There he planted the family tree when he married a Patwin, Coast Miwok woman from the Napa area, my great-great-great-grandmother, Quintole, or her Christian name, Ephrina Maria. The above chronology concerning my ancestors is what the written documents show, but there are no first-person accounts to tell me what Faustino, Obelinda, Liberato, and Ephrina Maria felt. I often wonder what their lives were like before the Spanish invaded. What did they really think about those padres, as much as I'd like to know? And I'd like to mention a word that I used before the Spanish invaded, because I know other people will say before the Spanish explored, before they settled, before they colonized. Hey, listen, they were undocumented illegal aliens that crossed the border. I often like to say that Junipero Serra was the first undocumented illegal alien to cross from Mexico into California because he did not have the permission of the Kumeyaay Indians to enter the San Diego area. So sometimes words can hurt, and particular use of different interpretive words can be triggers to get us Native folks to get those knee-jerk reactions that like to kick in the you-know-where those people who perpetuate such misnomers. Here's a family tree that's been worked out, and what it does is it demonstrates what the written records tell me about my ancestral lineage. As you can see there in the corners in the gray area, those are digital images from the actual registers that tell us who's who. Now, in our family oral tradition, we were as far back as my ancestors, Ephrina Maria and Panfilio. But we then got to a point where we couldn't go any further back. Then Randy Milliken, one of the great ethnohistorians of the San Francisco Bay region, in 2002, did some research the old-fashioned way, just going ledger to ledger, and found Liberato and the Mission Dolores Register. It wasn't until Steve Hackle developed the California Historic Population Project that we were able to ask the computer to sort things, and that's when we found the furthest back generation that includes Poilenja. And then we brought the tree down to the modern family, and there you see my parents at the bottom, and my sister and her daughter and her granddaughter and her great-granddaughter, and there's my late mother there sitting in front of all of them. So at most of the California missions, people associate mission history with the early Spanish invaders. Doesn't that sound much better than colonizers or settlers? Because the Indians had trailblazed all the trails originally. The Indians had settled the place before those other people arrived. So that's one of those trigger words that interpreters can use that are very offensive to us Native folks. The Ohlones and other peoples who lived in communities surrounding the missions are left out of the story or are often portrayed only as victims of forced labor. The Native world of my ancestors was being overwhelmed. The environment was changing. Let's take this example. The oak tree produced the acorn, which was our staple of life. From the acorn, we were able to get our flour by grinding and crushing the acorns and making grain, as it were, for our cakes, for our bread, for our cereals. And yet, when the European animals arrived, the cow, the pig, the goat, the lamb, the horse, everything, they loved the acorn, and they started to destroy the native food chain. Also, the flu and the measles epidemic were very destructive. California Indians did not have immunity to the measles. 1806 was the most destructive year. A pandemic started at Mission San Diego in February. And by April 1806, it was in the San Francisco Bay Area. This epidemic at both San Francisco and Mission San Jose killed almost 400 Indians at each of those missions in a period of 3 days. It was a terrible time. And it was a time of survival, and the Indian peoples came to the missions to survive because their natural world was being destroyed. But that's not the whole story. Time and time again, I proudly remind people the mission was built by and for Indians, and I am determined to tell the neglected history. There is a need to tell the correct story. For example, in telling that story of the Indians building the missions, people will often brag about, well, you know, it was a Spanish church. No, it was an Indian church. It was an Indian house of worship built by Indians and used by Indians. At most of the California missions, on the average, the first 3,000 or 4,000 baptisms at a mission were Indians. 3,000 or 4,000 first marriages were Indian marriages. 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 funerals at each of those missions were Indian missions. There were some Spaniards involved, and then the Mexican world took over, but yet the missions were used by Indians, and so they are Indian houses of worship. Some missions in the San Francisco Bay Area, including Mission Dolores, Mission San Jose, and Mission Santa Clara, are currently striving to accurately discuss Native resistance, perseverance, and a continuity into the modern day. We know, as often people tell me, oh, I know about Father Narciso Duran at Mission San Jose. He started the Indian choir. And then I say, yes, but do you know that it was also Father Narciso Duran at Mission San Jose that used to give out the beatings with a whip on Sunday mornings after Mass on the front steps of the mission? Or Father Narciso Duran would also lock up all the little Indian girls at nighttime in what we know as the mojaria. And the reason being not necessarily so, as I've been told by some interpreters, that it was to protect the girls. And then I asked them, protect them from who? And they look at me wanting to almost say their fathers. And I'm going, no, you mean from the soldiers. But the reason you lock up the children at night is that way the parents won't run away. What parents would run away if their children were locked up and they couldn't bring them with them? Other missions largely ignore the Indian community and push the issue and concerns aside while favoring that romanticized image of Spanish history of California, vaqueros, and zealous missionaries. Historically, little has been done at California missions to accurately tell the Native perspective. Inaccurate presentations of the California Indian story is wrong on multiple levels. I know, like at my home mission, Mission San Jose, people like to often tell the story of the rebel Indian by the name of Stanislaus. That's a good story, but today, by using the death registers, people are doing research, the mission death registers, I mean, and they're going through, because, you know, when you're born, you get a little blurb in the newspaper, how big you are, how much you weigh, who your parents are. When you die, if you've had a good long life, it tells all the things you did. Well, in the mission registers now, people are researching the trades of the various Native peoples. And one thing we're finding is there were more troublemaking Indians at Mission San Jose than at any other mission, because it's all recorded in their death entries. We as community leaders are obliged to ensure that the California Indian experience at missions is portrayed with visibility, accuracy, and fairness. This is not solely an issue of tourism or museum work, but an issue of social justice. Here are some of the common current misrepresentations that I find and other Native peoples find at California missions. That they perpetuate hurtful stereotypes that California Indian people are extinct, vestiges of the past. How many times do you visit a mission and perhaps the first room you walk in, the museum, done in a chronological order, tells you about the history of the local Native peoples before the missions arrived. And then the next thing you see is the interaction when the first padres arrive and attempt to make friends with the Native peoples. Then you have the Indians coming into the missions and they're learning how to make adobe bricks and build the mission. And they're learning how to be vaqueros with the cattle on the ranch there. And they're also becoming farmers growing corn and other crops. Then the next thing you know is you have the revolution from Spain, and suddenly we're now Mexico. And then we have the Rancho period, or what I call the time of, not Pancho Villa, but who's the other guy that was there? It'll come to me, the brain freeze for the moment. But anyway, you get into that Rancho period where, you know, we have romanticized stories again, and then we turn in with the gold rush, and then suddenly we become the United States of America, and the story of the Indian is no longer in the picture. We're out of the picture. So these are the effects that the self-esteem and confidence of thousands of California Indian school children who are mandated to go on tours to the missions. I know in our family, there was one of my father's sisters, my aunts, her granddaughter came on a school group to visit my home mission. And when there, she saw in one of the displays a picture of her great-grandmother, my grandmother Dolores. And she said to her class and to the adults and even to the docent giving the tour, "That's my great-grandmother." The docent turned to the little girl and in front of her classmates said, "Oh, quit making things up. You know, the Indians are all dead." Thank you very much. But that's what happens to many Native peoples as we go on tours of our own missions. It lessens the chance of reconciliation and healing between California Indian communities and, yes, and the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church owns and operates 19 of the 21 current California missions. It causes anger and distrust in California Indian communities against the missions because it gives inaccurate information and lies to the general public about California mission history. What to stay away from, please, when you're doing these types of interpretations. And again, this is not only just for a mission, but if you have a local history museum, or if you're trying to promote your own territorial local history, especially along the Anza Trail. Don't ignore the Indians. The Indians were here for thousands of years. And guess what? We're here still. So don't promote that myth that we are extinct. Sometimes in our exhibits, we have grave goods put on display. Don't use them unless you have the direct consent of the modern tribal communities. Just because it was found in some old farmer's field doesn't mean you can put it on display, because that farmer's field probably is an old Indian cemetery. Portraying California Indians in minimalistic, unflattering ways. Remember that most of our material culture was made from organic materials. That means feathers and animal skins. And so those don't survive. Our culture is richer than mortars and pestles and arrowheads, which is what you commonly see on exhibits in our California missions. Using terms, as I talked about earlier, New World, the Spanish discovering us, and the Spanish building the missions. I often tell folks, there were 2 padres and maybe 5 military people at a mission. And then there were 1,000 Indians. Who do you think built the missions? The Indians built the missions. Remember, this part of the world is not very new at all to the people who have lived here for thousands of years. So here's some ways to move forward. incorporating the California Indian experience in all aspects of the mission story, because we lived through it all. We lived through the mission period. We lived through the Rancho period. We lived through the gold rush. We lived through the various world wars. And here we are today. We're still here, telling visitors of the continued Indian presence into the modern day and how we resisted and survived the missions through difficult times. Consult with Indian folks. Hire Indian people from the local California Indian communities on what is appropriate and to interpret our own history. Understand that California Indian communities still have deep ties to the missions. Foster connectedness between modern communities and the mission. Aid in providing genealogical information to local Indian communities. Excuse me. At all of our missions, most of us have the original registers, the birth, the marriage, and the death registers. If not, we have microfiche copies. And then today we even have better digital image copies. Our duty is to be able to share this information with the Native communities. And often the Native communities say, they won't even let me look at the books. So here we go. This is a wonderful way that the Native people can be let in. Let us use the missions as our own cultural spaces. I know many a time, many Indian folk will visit a mission. They'll brag that their ancestors are either buried in the cemetery adjacent to the property or that they were baptized in the mission church. I know here at Mission San Jose, my home mission, the baptismal font that arrives in 1809, my great-great-great-grandmother was baptized in it in 1815, and one of my sister's granddaughters was baptized in it in 1998 by her own great uncle, my brother, who happens to be a Catholic priest. So these are places that we call home. Do not charge us to enter buildings our ancestors built. As we talk about my ancestors or my relatives who visit missions, they brag about this. The people perhaps at the gift shop or the entrance will even get excited telling the other tourists, look here, we have some Indian folk whose ancestors built this mission. And then as the visiting Indians make to go into the museum, those same people at the gift shop entrance will say, oh, wait a minute, excuse me. That's $5 per child and $7 per adult. What an awful feeling when you know your ancestors were forced to build those buildings and now they charge you an entrance fee. Don't do that. Provide ways to commemorate the people who perished at the missions with dignity and respect. I would say on the average, most mission cemeteries have a small little plaque that says, this plaque is here to acknowledge the 4,000 Indians, faithful and friendly, who are buried in this cemetery. Something more needs to be developed. So we also need to acknowledge the Junipero Serra issue. You can't walk around that either. So when studying Junipero Serra, one must first study the California Indians. And when studying the missions of Alta California, one must also first study the California Indians, as both Junipero Serra and the missions of Alta California are all about Indians. On the Junipero Serra issue, there is absolutely no documentary evidence to indicate that Serra ever mistreated anyone, either personally or indirectly. On the contrary, he was harshest on himself, seeking to transcend his personal faults through privation and self-mortification. The California missions and missionaries have always had their detractors and probably always will. Fueled by emotion rather than persuaded by fact, the allegations tend to generalize and blame Serra for every excess and abuse that occurred during the entire 1769 to 1834 mission period, 65 years, the lifespan of a man. The mission system's greatest sin was not individual shortcomings, but inculpable 18th century ignorance. Unable to solve complex medical, social, and environmental problems, the Indian community population was drastically reduced especially through disease. However, the worst was yet to come. When the American flood of manifest destiny swept into California seeking hides, pelts, golds, and statehood, the decline was catastrophic. California's estimated pre-1769 Indian population of 300,000 dropped to approximately 225,000 by the end of the mission period in 1834. But between 1848 to 1900, it fell to an alarmingly low of 20,000. Whether Spanish, English, Russians, or even if no settlers had preceded the Americans, the result would have been the same. At least the Spanish, and I got to give this to the Spanish, they sought to incorporate the Indians into their economic and social structure, including through marriage, rather than rigidly excluding and exterminating them. The primary focus of the California missions was the Indians. Central to the effort of the Franciscan Padres at all the California missions was to gather native peoples into villages surrounding the location of a mission. At these transitional villages, the native peoples underwent a process called reducción. Can you believe it? They reduced the Indian into a Spaniard. There they were reduced into the missions by being taught Christian doctrine and morality, as well as European cultural values. Spanish law provided that Indian tribes entering the mission system would have their lands preserved intact under the management of the mission padres. And this also meant that the lands were to be returned to the Indians when the Indians had learned how to become good Spanish citizens, which meant tax-paying citizens. Each mission would be the beginning of a civilian town, and they would be located at regular intervals up the entire stretch of the colony along the Anza Trail. The mission's brief history is one of remarkable achievements and swift decline. The missions were the primary centers of religious, cultural, and agricultural activity. Spanish soldiers and nearby presidios were available for protection against other European powers, pirates, and hostile natives from the interior. Junipero Serra and his companions trained the Indians in masonry so the missions could be raised, as well as farming and ranching, winemaking, candle making. I believe a total of 56 trades were taught at the California missions. In return, the natives agreed to live in or around the mission, helping to maintain the fields and livestock while they learned the ways of God and the church. For both Junipero Serra and the Indians, adaptability to new ways was essential to survival. Well, the definitive, accurate study of California Indians, the Franciscan Padres, and the Spanish military at Mission Dolores, Mission San Jose, and Mission Santa Clara has yet to be written. I believe that I am trailblazing the groundwork for such a study. This is an exciting time in the history of scholarship at the San Francisco Bay Region Mission. Historical research especially continues here at Mission Dolores in San Francisco, where in the year 1785, 1 year after the death of Junipero Serra, Padre Francisco Palou penned his Vita del Padre Junipero Serra, the life of Junipero Serra. Thank you. Show the pictures.
You could go on a little
I
more.
mean, do you want me? Well, it's questions and answer time. If you want, can we show my thank you slides and that then? Josh,
Sure.
maybe- We don't have control here. There. So if after our question and answer session, you would like to contact me, there is my email address, and I'm sure that it could be shared with all those who registered from the organization. And also I include here, but we're not going to spend a whole bunch of time, but the table of contents of our Mission Dolores Teacher's Manual, which we use and we share with the teachers as they prepare to bring the students. And then the next, we have the table of contents of our docent's manual, which it's okay. I think we're flipping past it. But then I'd like to always acknowledge my mentor, Father Noel Maholi, and then the Franciscan friars of the province of Santa Barbara, and then the Jeremiah brothers, Joshua and Lionel, who prepare these PowerPoint presentations and help me along. The next slide is the bibliography that I've prepared. Okay, here we go. Is somebody on your end running the slides now? We seem to have lost control on our end. So here's some primary source material on concerning California Indians. And then the next slide is concerning some more readings, especially we get to the San Francisco area, A Time of Little Choice by Randy Milliken, and the Native Americans at Mission San Jose. And then we have a monumental work that was completed in 2004 by Jim Sandos. And then we have Steve Hackle's work in 2005. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we have the life of Junipero Serra, and it can be found in the Santa Barbara archives, but it's also published. I believe I have one more slide at least. Yes, and then we have some suggested readings, modern text on Junipero Serra, Rosemary Beebe and Bob Sankiewicz from the University of Santa Clara, their work that was published in 2015, and then Steve Hackle's work that was published in 2013. And I believe that's the end of the slides, isn't it?
Yes. So
Good.
we're going to go ahead and do the Q&A now.
Yes.
So the first question that we have for you, Andrew, is how can the California tribes still like the missions when such atrocities were done to the Indians?
That's a very good question. Now, most of us Native peoples aren't lovers of missions, but we acknowledge the missions are places that represent survival. Our ancestors built these missions. I often have Native peoples who will come into the mission and they will touch the very walls, because I've heard some describe and say that our DNA is in every adobe brick that is in that building. And what happens is I've had other Native folks tell me that it's coming like to visit if you had Polish ancestors or German Jewish ancestors of the Second World War who had been in a prison camp in Germany or in Poland, and Native peoples come to these places and they survive. But the other thing is this, in most of us in California connected to the missions, the Catholic religion is still our faith. I've had many a Native person on the phone with me complaining about the missions, and I'm also always inviting them to come to the missions so that they can assist in helping to make some of these changes. And then they say, but I wouldn't go there. And then I ask those questions that, you know, sometimes are zinger questions. And I'll ask, when the last time there was a new member of your family, where did you take that child for initiation rites, which I mean is baptism? Or the last time there was a wedding in your family, where did you go to have the ceremony? Or the last time perhaps somebody in your family died, where did you demand to have the funeral? And generally the sound on the other end of the phone is silence, because the answer is, we went to the mission. There are places that acknowledge survival into the present, and yet they are very difficult places because they represent so much of the attempted destruction of our culture. But now we are revitalizing our culture, and these are the places that we would like to make use of, to have basket weaving classes, to have language classes taught by our own people and using those very facilities. But is it too much to ask to use the facilities without charge? I hope that answered the question.
Okay, second question is there any effort at the other California missions to reinterpret their history to build a much greater inclusion of the Native people?
Yes, I believe all the missions are trying in one way or another. The difficulty is, can we get things so that we're not just left as things of the past? In other words, yeah, most missions do a pretty good job on the Indians before the missions, and maybe even a little bit on the Indians coming into the missions. But where do we see the story of Native peoples involved at the mission today? And that's because of the very first question of Native peoples not wanting to go to those missions. How do we get Native peoples into the missions? That's the same problem Junipero Serra said. How do we get Indian folks into the missions? But it's very difficult when you have folks at missions that ignore the Indian question or continue to brag everything about it being Spanish, but yet when we know the Spanish were only here for a good 20, 25 years at some of our missions, and then it's a Mexican world. And then they even ignore the Mexican world.
Okay, the next question is, how was the transition in language for Native people, including Spanish?
How was the transition in language? Well, Spanish during the mission period, I take it that's what the question is about. The Native peoples were taught Spanish. They were forced to speak Spanish, which was the Koine of the world at that time because all of Spain was so huge. And so the native languages were suppressed and Native peoples had to speak Spanish to be part of that Spanish world. When the native languages were suppressed, though, it's ironical that the padres started writing down dictionaries and vocabularies of our languages, that those are the very places now that we are returning to as we revitalize our languages. As the great revitalizer of our native language here in the San Francisco East Bay, the Chochenyo language, my cousin Vincent Medina says, the language went to sleep because people would still speak it privately in the evenings. We know that any oppressed people, you do in public what the conquerors want you to do, but very much in the privacy of your own home, you speak your native language. And now it's coming back. A lot of the Indian folks speak Spanish today and don't even know their native languages. And so there's both good and bad in that. And so the efforts to revitalize our native languages are because they were suppressed and natives were taught to speak Spanish at the missions. It was a rough transition, I would imagine.
Okay, next question is for Naomi. How many days do we need to visit the whole Anza Trail?
Ooh.
Oh, that's a rough question. Well, if you drive really fast, it'll take you maybe 2 days. But then, you know, of course, there are really interesting places to stop along the route. If the route begins in Orcasitas, Sonora, and that would take you about a day. But, you know, it's all how long you want to stop. So it could take you 2 days to a whole month.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, has there been progress in signage and storytelling at Mission San Jose?
I think that's the challenge that is now once again upon us at Mission San Jose. We have a new pastor who was just installed last Friday night, and the exhibits need to be updated. And I think that's perhaps what the signage is about, is the last time the exhibits were updated, they were done by a wonderful team, Beverly Lane and I can't think of the other's lady name. They were from Danville that assisted in doing the exhibits. And that was done 25 years ago in 1996 before the bicentennial. And that was another story of Native input, because the administrator of the mission really wasn't pleased with what I was trying to do 25 years ago. And so we had to work through, or I had to work through, and my father had to go through with working very happily with Beverly Lane from Danville. I can't think of the other lady's name right now. But anyway, they would run all the label copy and the text and the exhibit designs past me and my father. And then they would present them to the administrator because they knew that at least we weren't going to balk about them because we had already approved them. But that's often, you know, for some Native people, getting their foot in the door is you have to work behind the scenes. And the objective is to get the story in there. But still, sometimes the stories need to be enhanced and improved. And that's what I'm seeing as a future as things are beginning to move along with a change of administration, both in the parish and in the mission itself.
Okay, and we have another question from Steve Larice. Says, thank you. I'm trying to understand Ohlone culture and the tribes that comprise it. Could you speak to how you want to see Ohlone culture spoken about? Is Ohlone a tribe, or is it a culture made up of several tribes that need to be acknowledged individually?
Yes, yes, and yes. So we are the Ohlone culture, and the Ohlone world is basically San Francisco at the north, where the Golden Gate Bridge takes off, and all the way down to Big Sur. And basically, it's the 9 San Francisco Bay region counties of San Francisco, San Mateo, Contra Costa, Alameda, San Benito, Santa Clara, Monterey, and Santa Cruz. Those are the area that's considered Ohlone. There are 7 of the 21 Alta California missions in Ohlone world. When you get into tribal groups, now we're talking modern political entities. And so, yes, there are very many groups and also different language dialects within our group. So the thing is like I study and mostly speak about my ancestral villages and missions, which are grouped in the north to San Francisco, Santa Clara, and San Jose. And that would be a different geographical area that we are interrelated by marriage, we are interrelated by bloodlines, our languages are very similar, and the way we live along the coast and the San Francisco Bay are similar. When you would get down to Monterey Bay, and then you have the different groups down there, and so on and so on. So I'm not sure what Steve is asking as far as, is Ohlone a tribe or not? Yes, we are a tribe. We are very many different groups. Ohlone, we know, was the name of a village along the coast down over by Half Moon Bay, but yet it is the most common name that most of us Ohlone people today will self-identify with.
Okay, so that's all the time we have right now for questions. We will submit any other questions that we haven't answered to Andrew and Naomi, and they can answer those questions offline. I do want to thank you again for attending today's webinar, and for more information, you can find our educational resources up at our IANTA website, and we will email the recorded webinar today to all of the registrants of this webinar session. Again, for future webinars, you can take a look at our webinar page at theianta.org. And if you are not a member of IANTA and would like to be, please contact Gail Shihak. She is our Tribal Relations and Outreach Manager by email at gshihak@ianta.org, and Sherry will enter that information in our chat box for you. Again, thank you, Andrew and Naomi. We are very pleased that you are here today with us. And Andrew, thank you for your insight on the missions and tribes. And we'd like to let you be on your way. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And again, thank you for Josh for being my technical assistant throughout this.
Thank you all.
Thank you.